Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're really pleased to see everyone. As well, I think we have some parents from St. Michael's School up as well. So welcome to them as well. For the parents in low, could you just let us know if you can hear us properly, please?
Yep, we can hear you fine, thank you.
Great. So I'd really like to warmly thank the school board for providing us with this amazing room tonight for our session. And I'd also like to thank Lisa Falastoni, Director of Complementary Services, for helping us out, and Josette for being her partner in crime tonight, as you'll see later. Also to Mike Nealon, who's our wonderful technician and helps us through navigate that technology part of it. I'd also like to acknowledge Connexions staff who really did a lot of work to put this together. And so at the back of the room, there's Nat, who's our communications person, coordinator. And in the hallway, Ginny, she's hiding out in the hallway, who's our program coordinator. And I'm Danielle Lange, Executive Director for Connexions Resource Centre. So there's lots of information out in the hallway that you can take. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, who's Joanne Doucette, and who's been here on a few occasions and always been extremely interesting and provided lots of great information for parents. So Joanne is a social worker for the, I always have to look, at the Children and Adolescent Family Centre of Ottawa. So anyways, thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it over to Joanne.
Joanne, can I ask you one favor? Could you people on the screen actually know who you are?
Yes, just come over and say hi. Hi, everyone. Okay. Sorry that I can't stay here the whole time, but I will travel, okay? All right. Wonderful. It's so nice to be back tonight. A big thank you to Connexions and to the school board, to everybody that worked to make this happen. This is always a really friendly crowd, a really engaged and interesting group of parents. And I think there might be some teachers here. Any teachers in the room? Okay, great. And I'm guessing that the rest of you are all parents of kids that are in the school board? Yeah, okay, great. So tonight we're going to talk about anxiety, and this is a big focus in my practice, as it is for a lot of us that are working in mental health, because anxiety is actually the most common reason for referral to organizations like CAFCO, where I work, to places like CHIO that serve children and youth in this kind of wider Ottawa and surrounding area, and actually everywhere, right? This is what we're seeing is that there's been a huge surge in mental health in general among kids and youth, and definitely anxiety is a very frequent issue that we see. So we thought that would be a really good topic for tonight, and one that maybe a lot of parents have concerns about, whether it's that you see your kids struggling with a high level of anxiety, or you might see it in other kids that you know, or just have a concern about how to make sure you can really increase resilience and prevent it from being an issue with your kids. So I hope to be able to help you with some of that tonight. So we're going to kind of start out by talking about the big picture, looking at why there is so much anxiety and how anxiety works. And then I'm going to give some case examples to give some context, and we'll use those case examples as we get into strategies that we can use. And there is so much with anxiety, so I kind of narrowed in on like a handful of strategies that I think will be most possible for you to start using at home if you're looking for some things to help your kids. But obviously in an hour and a half we can only cover so much. So one thing that's important to remember about anxiety is it's actually an emotion like any other emotion. Right? So it's an emotion just the way happiness is, or feeling scared, or feeling angry. All of these are emotions. So to feel some anxiety is totally normal, and that in itself is not a problem. In fact, I bet you there's a lot of us here in the room today who probably felt anxious at some point. Anybody here who felt some anxiety, some worry, some nervousness today? I know I did. Yeah, so I had a pretty busy day at work, so there was a few times where I was sort of running around and feeling a little bit anxious. And then even on my way home from work, thinking about how to get my kids out the door to an event they had tonight and how to get here in time and wondering about traffic, coming across. Of course, there's some anxiety, right? But actually, to feel some anxiety can be very helpful because it can make us work and be productive and be on time for things. So me being anxious when I got home from work about kind of getting everything done and getting here on time was helpful because it actually made me move quickly and be here on time tonight. So remember that some of it is okay. So when is it a problem? It's a problem when your kids are feeling so much anxiety that it's interfering with their ability either to go to school or to be happy at school, at home, out in the community. When it's interfering with our day-to-day routines, and when you see them really not able to cope with that, then it's an issue. So we're going to talk about that today. I did want to mention that's really small, and I apologize, by the way, this is a PDF file, that's on me, that it doesn't take up the full screen, but I work on Mac, and so there's a little bit of issues transferring over. So I did want to just mention, questions are welcome all along. If there's something you're not understanding or you want to clarify, just give me a little wave as we go through the presentation. I'm really open to that. I did want to mention that in the time we have tonight, it's really hard to be able to help with questions about individual kids because every child is so unique. So just keep that in mind that I'm talking about anxiety in general we can do, but answering questions about specific kids and their issues, we just don't have the time to do that tonight. But I am going to talk towards the end of the presentation about resources that are out there and when you should get professional help and how to go about accessing that. Yes?
Your presentation, is it available afterward on the website, or do you need our email address?
I'm happy to share it. So
We'll have it.
Yes, so there is going to be a way to do that, yeah. And I think last year that happened.
Yeah, we put all the resources and everything on the website, and we'll share it through Facebook to make sure everyone gets it.
So it will be shared for sure. I'm very happy to do that. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go over 3 different case examples, and obviously these names have all been changed and details to protect the identity of these kids, and a lot of them are inspired by sort of a couple of kids put together. But I have one, which is about Jenny, and Jenny's 8 years old, and she's always found separation difficult. So a lot of her anxiety is around separation from parents. So this is a child who, right from early days going to daycare was very anxious at drop-off and would cry. In kindergarten, it continued. The anxiety has continued right up to, at 8 years of age. And now where the parents see it the most is that at bedtime, there is a long, drawn-out process. And this is something I hear from a lot of parents, that when bedtime is starting to drag out to a couple of hours, and the child can't fall asleep alone, and they're getting older, and the expectations are getting up, but there's so much anxiety, it can create so much stress for families. And so what happens with Jenny is she can only fall asleep if her parents are actually lying in bed with her. And because she needs that to fall asleep, if she has wake-ups in the night, which is natural, we all tend to wake up at night, she can't get back to sleep without her parents being present. So then she ends up running into her parents' room and waking them up. And of course, when parents get stressed themselves and get frustrated, and either she can hear the frustration in their tone of voice, or they raise their voice, then what happens? Her anxiety goes up, she's more anxious, she has more trouble falling asleep, and around we go. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anybody, but I think it's not an uncommon issue in families where kids are more sensitive and anxious. All right, I'll go to case example number 2. So this is a boy named Henry who's 10 years old, and he's very fearful of insects. And there's a number of different fears that are very common at different points of development. So actually, this is not an uncommon thing for kids to get scared of, is bugs. Another example would be weather and thunderstorms. A lot of kids around, school-age years, they get really scared of weather patterns. There's a number of things like that that are not uncommon. But when it starts again to interfere in a child's ability to do things that kids should be able to do, like go outside and play, then it's going to be an issue. So Henry definitely is very affected by this. So he doesn't want to go outside and play, so the weather is nice, it's springtime, it's summer, and he's refusing to go to his soccer games, to play in sports. He's refusing to play outside with the neighborhood kids, and parents love eating out on their back patio, and there's no way he's going to eat on the back patio because there's a garden, and he's very scared about the bugs being around the flowers. So this is really getting in the way. And when his parents try and push him and explain that he has to do these things, the anxiety also comes out in behavior. So he gets very oppositional, he gets angry and frustrated, and there's a lot of behavioral issues that they're dealing with. So of course, then parents start to kind of avoid the issue because they don't want to be fighting with him all the time. And my third and final case example is a girl named Leah, who's 11 years old, so she's in grade 6. And Leah's always had a more shy, sensitive personality. And her anxiety comes out a lot in terms of performance. So she's a kid that might get really anxious if she's, about to do her piano recital, or maybe play a sport. And what's happening right now is that all the grade 6 students have to do speeches, and she is terrified of getting up in front of her class to do a speech. So she's actually begging her parents, trying to negotiate that her parents ask the teacher for her to be exempted from doing her speech, to have an alternative assignment, because she's so against doing this. And Leah's parents are persisting and trying to get her to practice the speech, but every time they do, she ends up crying. She says she feels sick to her stomach. She gets really nauseous and shaky. They, of course, feel really bad for her. And she hasn't told her parents yet, but she has a plan that when it comes to the day she's supposed to be doing her speech, she's going to be sick and not go to school. Okay, so those are our case examples, and I'm going to touch on each of them as we go through the presentation and talk about anxiety and talk about strategies. So first, let's talk a little bit about why kids are so anxious. So first of all, there's about 10%, different experts will say different things, but what a lot of the literature points to is that about 10% of all kids are just born with a more sensitive, anxious personality. And sometimes you can see that from very early stages with babies that, are more difficult to soothe, and sometimes that continues on into different stages of development. But a lot of parents who have kids that are anxious will say that, they've seen it all the way through. Sometimes anxiety can crop up later on because of stresses. But yeah, about 10% have these sensitive traits, right? Sometimes we can use sensitive and anxious almost interchangeably, right? So kids that are sensitive and feel their emotions very strongly. And of those kids, a lot of them will learn to cope really well, and they can function very well despite having a more sensitive temperament. So that's totally possible. Kids can grow into adults that really thrive with those personality and temperament traits. It doesn't have to be a big issue. But there are some that will continue to struggle with anxiety. And what I want us to talk about tonight is, what do we have some control over? What can we do to really foster resilience and help kids to live really full lives, even if they have those more sensitive, anxious traits of personalities? And there's a lot of concerns right now that the current generation of kids and teenagers is experiencing much higher levels of anxiety than we previously saw. So while we know that that's always existed and people have always struggled with anxiety, that we're seeing a lot more of it. So there's a lot of different theories out there about why that is, and I just want to touch on those briefly, because I think it's important for us to talk about that if we're going to know what we can do to intervene and try and change that as well. So first of all, like I mentioned, there is sort of a genetic factor, I guess we could call it, in that kids sometimes inherit those traits of being more sensitive or more anxious. So you see this in a lot of families. A lot of times when I'm working with kids that are anxious, there's one or both parents that also have anxiety. So again, we inherit certain traits, like being maybe a little more shy or introverted, feeling emotions really intensely. And of course, as parents, we model things for our kids all the time too, so that can go hand in hand. So there is a bit of an environmental factor there too. But then there's this whole other issue that, again, over the last 10 years, what we're seeing is consistently there's been this surge of mental health issues among kids. And I'm trying to think of what year it kind of really started, but I think like around 2010, 2012 is when CHEO, for example, started saying that their emergency rooms were just, flooded. And, there'd always been spikes and then things would settle, and it never has really settled. Nobody can kind of keep up. So what is that about? Why have we seen such an increase? Well, over the last 10 years, we've also seen a cultural shift that is huge because of technology. So while every generation will look back on a previous generation and talk about how it's different, there really is no comparison in terms of how much has changed in just about 10 years, right? So we're in 2018, and when you think back to 2008, that was just around when smartphones started becoming very prevalent, right? Before that, sure, everybody had cell phones, but they were flip phones who didn't have that constant access of everything at our fingertips. And I think around, again, the literature says maybe around like 2010, 2012 is when there was like a certain percentage, like a majority of the population that owned a smartphone. And so what a lot of people that work in the field, so people that work with kids, developmental psychologists, researchers are saying is, that this is the factor that seems to account for the shift, because there's not really anything else in our society or in North American culture that has changed so much other than, this introduction of technology. So I do want us to touch on that because, interestingly enough, it seems to be having such a negative impact on our kids, and there's some concerns, and yet kids all have so much access to it, even though we sort of know it's doing harm. And I think we all need to start really thinking differently about how we let kids access this if it's causing so much risk for them. So how does that work? How does technology in itself cause anxiety, for example? So it's kind of multifaceted. First of all, there's a constant barrage of stimulation and information that is, being given to kids via their screens all the time. They don't get a lot of breaks from that, and that in itself is like that constant level of stimulation and stress can be very difficult. So for example, many of us played video games as kids, but they were very different from the video games now. So the video games, I don't know, when I was a kid, I think it was like the original Nintendo and the Atari. I remember there being Super Mario Brothers. But Super Mario Brothers is very different from the kind of video games that kids are playing now, and I don't even really know them all. I don't have a video game system in the house, but I hear about the level of the graphics and the reality that kids feel. So what researchers have looked at is how when kids are playing these video games, their adrenaline is surging, right? It is really having a big impact on their brains. It's affecting them physiologically in a very different way than the video games of 30 years ago. So it's that barrage of information and stimulation. But also technology is a very easy escape from any worries or thoughts that are uncomfortable. So I hear this all the time from kids I'm working with and from young adults too. So the minute there's, for example, I had a university student telling me the other day, that he's got a pile of assignments that he has not handed in. He's super stressed and anxious about it. But as soon as he starts feeling some uncomfortable feelings, or he starts having thoughts like, how am I going to get that done? He quickly puts on a YouTube video. He quickly does something online that will give him a distraction. And young kids are telling me about this, and we know this is happening. And some of you might see that in your kids at home too, right? That it's just this constant distraction. And so we're going to be talking about avoidance and how avoidance is such a key part of the anxiety cycle. So when you think about it, technology provides constant availability of avoidance. And in order to actually overcome worries and be able to get to the other side, we have to let ourselves feel the anxiety. And we have to actually allow ourselves to think about things even though it's uncomfortable. So I'm going to talk a lot about that, but that's one of the, and then of course the other thing, which totally makes sense and is kind of obvious, is that if you spend hours and hours on a screen every day, you're not doing the things that we know are actually helpful in terms of reducing anxiety and stress. So for example, free play outdoors, actually I'll flip to the next slide because I kind of talk about, what builds emotional, on the other hand, what builds emotional resilience. So these are some of the things that are sometimes technology is interfering in kids accessing. So first of all, secure relationships with trusted adults. Some young people are very attached to, for example, their phones. So I see it in terms of when I go and get kids from the waiting room at CAFCO, that they're holding onto their phones and there's no way they're going to leave it behind to come in for their hour. And that the minute I maybe get up and go to get something from my desk, they're quickly checking it, and it's like it's physically attached to them, right? And you don't necessarily see that same reliance and attachment on the adults in their life. And that's really worrisome, right? We want kids to always look first to their parents for that security and that attachment. And time in nature, we know this is huge. Being in the outdoors, being in sunlight, this is so important for just boosting, releasing endorphins, feeling happy. Kids really need that. Free play and exercise. There's something about free play that's unstructured, where kids use their creativity, climbing trees and being adventurous, sometimes getting into trouble. All of this is actually really good for kids' development, right? When they're outside doing that kind of free play. And exercise in general, obviously, is super important. And exploring creativity. So making sure that kids have time to be bored, because that's often when they get creative. And when you have a creative outlet, so I know when I see kids and teens that have a real passion for art, or for music, or theater, this is a wonderful outlet for kids, right? It really boosts resilience and helps them with their mental health. And sometimes kids are less likely to turn, and that involves like hard work, right? To put time into doing a drawing. It's not necessarily that immediate instant gratification that we sometimes get with social media, with technology. So it's good to keep that in mind. Meaningful connections to family and community that are face-to-face. So again, when we look at the literature, one of the things that's being talked about is how when we're in front of screens, so for example, when a teenager is engaging with social media and gets a like on their Instagram, there's actually this surge of dopamine. And dopamine is very powerful. It makes us feel really, really good. And they've done studies that have shown that the hit of dopamine that kids get when someone likes, their picture on Instagram or when they're playing a video game is actually very similar to what happens with drug addicts. So that's how addictive it is. But the thing is, that's kind of very temporary, and it doesn't have the same benefits as some of the other happy hormones, like endorphins, which are released when we do exercise, right? Or oxytocin, which is the cuddle hormone. This is the hormone that's released when women breastfeed, but it's also what people feel when they have a really close emotional connection. When kids are cuddling with their parents, and you're having a really wonderful conversation and you feel really close to them, that's what they feel. That's really powerful. And that's the kind of experience that you can only get with face-to-face, in-person contact, which is very different than what kids are experiencing when they're, for example, connecting socially online with friends. It's a very superficial connection, and a lot of kids are talking about how lonely they feel. They might have 500 friends on Instagram, but they feel very, very alone. Okay? So I just wanted to talk briefly about that before we get into strategies, because I think to ignore it is really doing a disservice to our kids. We really have to think about that. And we can actually talk about that all night, but I'm going to try and cover some other aspects of how we can help kids with anxiety. All right. So I mentioned before that avoidance is a problem. So I want to explain a little bit about how that works. So when we're in situations that make us worry, if we avoid what is actually making us worry, we feel a little bit of temporary relief. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So I actually had, for many, many years, I had a lot of anxiety around public speaking. And that might seem kind of funny since I'm standing up in front of all of you, and I actually love doing this and I look forward to it. But for years and years, and I can remember when it started, I was in junior high, and we all know how junior high is not fun to begin with. And we had to do speeches, so kind of like Leah, who's one of my case examples tonight. And we had to do speeches, and I went up without any kind of help, like no cue cards, nothing to help me along. And I totally froze. I could not remember the next line. I was really stuck, and I just remember everybody staring at me and feeling so terrible, and I think I was 12 or 13. So it was a really hard experience. And from that point on, I believed I was terrible at public speaking. So once we develop a strong belief and a thought, right, we'll notice everything that supports that. So I avoided it at all costs. And that went right into my adult years. So when I was first working at CHIO, I was working on the inpatient mental health unit. And I didn't have to do a lot of public speaking like this, but we would have case conferences when kids were being discharged. I was very comfortable meeting with a family, just me and the family. But then we would have to be in the conference room, and there'd be maybe 8 to 10 professionals sitting around the table giving these families information about their child's stay. So I had to speak in front of everyone and give my feedback. It was maybe 5-10 minutes, and I just couldn't stand it. My voice would shake, I would get shaky, I'd get the dry mouth, all the anxiety symptoms. And it was terrible. So I used to try and avoid it as much as possible. If I could get out of doing anything like that, I would. But every time I got out of it, and I avoided it, it just reinforced my belief I was terrible at it, right? That I couldn't do it. It's only by actually doing these things and starting to do them well that we actually start to change our thoughts and that pattern. So I'm going to show you how that cycle kind of works. on the next slide.
Example, Joanne and public speaking. Is that?
That's me.
That's you.
I am
okay.
Joanne,
You're
yes.
Joanne.
That's me. So just to kind of draw it out, so we have this situation that causes anxiety. So for me, it was public speaking. And of course, if someone would mention that they needed me to do a talk or they needed me to speak to a group, I would start to emotionally feel the anxiety, right? And have those thoughts like, I can't handle this, I'm not going to do well, I hate doing this. And so then again, if I avoided it by, for example, sort of making it so that someone else on my team would do it instead or finding an excuse, I feel a little bit of relief. It kind of feels good when you first know you're going to get out of something that you really don't want to do, right? But then the problem is that long term, the worries don't go away because I'm still left with the reality that at some point this is going to come up again and I won't be any better at it. And in fact, I have less confidence in my ability to cope. It makes me feel really bad about myself and anxious. So the anxiety stays. Does that make sense to everybody? So avoidance is very, very powerful, and it's often a really big part of anxiety. And if any of you have kids that are struggling, you might be able to think of how that works. And we're going to talk about some of our case examples. Am I getting feedback a little bit or not? Okay. Everybody here is okay with sound good? No, just keep going forward. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so let's think about Henry, for example. Our little friend Henry, who's very scared of bugs, right? So Henry hates being around insects, and of course, the problem is the more he avoids being around them, so maybe he doesn't go outside to play, he refuses to go to his soccer game, then he gets a bit of temporary relief. So for example, if he has a soccer game, and he wins the battle with his parents, and he gets out of going. Of course, in the short term, he feels kind of good. Don't have to go, oh my goodness, I'm so happy, and probably does something else that's very comfortable, right? Plays video games or hangs out at home, whatever it is, and he feels much better. But every time he makes that choice and he avoids, he actually becomes more fearful. Because the way that anxiety maintains itself is it makes us overestimate how terrible the thing is that we have to do. So for years, I overestimated how awful it was going to be to get up in front of a group like this. It's actually kind of fun. And for Henry, he is really overestimating how bad it's going to be. What is the worst thing that could happen? He could get stung. It happens once in a while to kids. He would survive, A mosquito might come and bite him, and he would get itchy, and it would bother him, and he would maybe be scratchy. But he is overestimating just how awful it's going to be, and he's also underestimating his ability to cope with it. So he's not really able to see that even if a mosquito was bothering him, he would be able to cope with the bite and the itchiness, right? So we overestimate how bad it's going to be, and we underestimate our ability to cope. Does that make sense? And that's how anxiety maintains itself. Oh, right. Yeah, we already had that one. Oh, okay. No problem. Okay, perfect. Just one more forward? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the intervention. So that's a little bit of an overview. And don't hesitate to ask questions if any of that doesn't make sense, or even as we get to the end, if you want to go back and talk about any of that, we can. But I wanted to get into what we can actually do. So there's 4 main interventions that we're going to work on tonight. And I'm hoping that these are things that you'll feel comfortable to try out with your kids at home that are really going to be helpful to you. Okay. Yeah, I really like that slide. That's okay. Thank you. So the framework that we're actually going to look at tonight is, has anybody heard about cognitive behavioral therapy? Anyone? Yeah, people have heard that term. So this is what cognitive behavioral therapy is really all about. It's about the connection between our thoughts. So what I always say to kids is I always do this. Thoughts are in our head. It's what's going on up here. Our feelings, so either what we feel physically or our emotions, like in our heart, right? And then behaviors. So by behaviors, I mean what we're doing, or in some cases, what we're not doing. Like avoidance is a behavior, right? And it's things we're not doing. And those 3 things really intersect when it comes to anxiety, right? So in my example of the public speaking, if I had a thought, I'm terrible at this, and I'm gonna look silly, I'm gonna embarrass myself, because my voice is gonna shake, and I'm gonna get so red, and if all those thoughts are going through my head, how do I actually start to feel physically? At it. So there we kind of get how those things really intersect, right? They're all connected. Perfect. So if we go back to the example of Leah, who's the grade 6 student that's really worried about doing her speech in front of her class, we can kind of look at how those three things are connected for her. So first of all, she's having thoughts like, what if I make a mistake and other kids laugh at me? Right? Often when kids are anxious about performance-related things, they're worried about not doing well, and they're worried about embarrassment or not looking smart. Those are things we hear from kids a lot. So that's the thought up in her head. What's the feeling that she's got? So first of all, physically, she's got a lot of the symptoms that I've already described that I remember her having, right? So she might feel sweaty or shaky. Her heart might be beating fast. She might be breathing shallow. She might have upset stomach. Right? And all of that feels really bad. So we know when we're feeling really, really anxious, it's a terrible feeling. Of course, we want to escape it. And so then what are the behaviors that result? So Leah might start thinking about ways to get out of it. Like she's already got a plan that she's going to be sick on the day of her speech and stay home. And even when maybe practicing her speech, or actually if she is forced to get up and do the speech, she might end up doing things like talking too quickly, that then just reinforce the thoughts and reinforce the feelings. Okay, so this is the first step we're going to work on. And for people who, I don't know if there's anyone who came to, which was the workshop where we did calm breathing. I think it was 2 years ago, when we did, mindfulness. Yeah, we did mindfulness. Did anybody come to that workshop? Anyways, we did work on this 2 years ago for the people that were here. But we can never do too much of this anyways. So is there anybody in the room who actually does use deep breathing as a way to relax? So for example, anyone who practices yoga? Yeah. So if you do yoga, then you kind of know about how to do the abdominal breathing. Anybody that does any meditation or mindfulness activities? Okay, good. So actually there's quite a few people in the room that are familiar. So what calm breathing is all about is basically doing these deep abdominal breaths. So when we're anxious and nervous, we do a couple of things. First of all, we tend to breathe shallow. We're not taking really good breaths. And that means we're not getting enough oxygen and makes us feel a lot worse. And actually also we hold our breath a lot without even realizing we're doing it when we're really nervous. And a lot of times when I talk about this with kids, then they think about it and they say, yeah, I do that. I hold my breath. And then you get really tense, and it leads to a lot of problems. And so this is actually a really key strategy for, if kids can get good at doing this, it's a way for them to feel more in control, and it's also a way to slow down that interaction of factors. So if Leah, for example, learns to do calm breathing, and that helps her to slow down and to feel more in control over those physical symptoms, she might be less shaky, her heart rate might calm down, and those things are going to help her to then feel calmer and more in control. So I'm going to show you the basic technique and just explain how it works. So I'm just going to actually attach the mic, see if that works. I've got my hands free. Everybody can hear me? Oh, I'm going to just put it up a little. Can you hear me okay? So what we do is, I like to put hands on belly. Some people like to put one hand on their chest, one hand on belly. But the most important thing is for kids to really feel the breath coming. I'm going to show you exactly how it works. Yes, good idea. So we're going to breathe in through the nose to a count of 4. And when you breathe in, you should feel your belly sort of expand. So think of your belly being like a balloon. And when you breathe in, it fills with air. And then when you breathe out through your mouth, when you exhale slowly, then the air goes out, right? So it looks like this. Deep breath in through the nose, and slow breath out through the mouth. So I'm just going to go over here for our other participants. So maybe I'll get everybody in the audience to do it with me now. So if you can just put your hands on your belly, and actually sitting in a chair is a very good way to do deep breathing, right? So just sitting up, making sure that you're nice and relaxed, kind of feeling like your shoulders relax. put your hands on your belly. And whenever you're ready, take a deep breath in to about a count of 3 or 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then breathe out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just going to do it now without counting so that I can actually do it properly. So we should feel our belly kind of rise as we breathe in. And then the air goes out as we breathe out. So this is a good thing to practice at home where you maybe feel a little less self-conscious and more comfortable. And even if you can just set aside 2 minutes a day to do 10 deep breaths in and out like that, that's a great start, right? And that's how you can start building on it. So that's the basic technique. But when we're doing it with kids, it's really good to make it a little more fun for kids, right? So I have a couple of examples to give. So one is called the flower candle trick. Has anybody ever heard of this before? So this is really nice. Yes, there's a few people that have heard of it. So what you do is you tell kids, and kids are good at using their imagination. So we tell them to hold a flower in one hand. You can even ask them, what does the flower look like? What kind of flower do you have? And then they're holding a candle in the other hand, and you get them to imagine that the candle is lit. And then they're going to sniff the flower and blow out the candle. Right? So if everybody just wants to try it together, so imagine your flower. Just come over here for our other friends. So we're going to hold our flower in one hand and our candle in the other. And then just do a nice slow sniff of the flower. And then blow out the candle. Okay. And another similar idea is thinking of cookies coming out of the oven. So you could talk to kids about, just imagine you just baked some cookies and you take them out of the oven, right? So you sniff the cookies, they smell so good. And then you have to blow on them to cool them down. Right? So getting kids to use kind of some visualization and their imagination is often a way to really engage them. And I've definitely used the candle flower trick a lot. I just heard about the cookie one more recently. And that's a big hit with kids. They really like that. If you're interested, so if you're interested in learning ways to teach deep breathing to kids, there's a lot of good resources, even if you Google online. So there's something that we did at the mindfulness workshop called square breathing, which is very popular with kids. It involves drawing a square on a piece of paper and following along on all sides. And you can look it up if you're interested. But there's lots of ways to teach deep breathing to kids. And when they learn to do this, it's very, very powerful. My daughter, I have 2 kids. My son is 13, my daughter is 11, and my daughter is definitely a very sensitive, anxious kid, so I've dealt with it as a parent, not just as a therapist, and it's way more challenging to help your own kid than it is to help other people's children. And when I remember back probably 3 or 4 years ago, teaching her how to do deep breathing, and she seemed sort of interested. And then I remember one day her brother really picking on her in the back seat. When you're stuck in the car and you're on a long drive and the kids start fighting and it's just the worst. And she was getting really, really upset. And then all of a sudden I look in the rearview mirror and she's just sitting there staring out the window, doing her deep breathing to calm down. And she was doing it perfectly and it really worked. She went from being really upset and crying to being so calm, which really annoyed her brother. He couldn't get at her anymore. So it's very powerful when we see kids, learn to really manage their anxiety with that and be able to feel like they have some control over all those awful physical symptoms that crop up. Okay, so that's one. So this one is going to take us a little longer to go through. It's a really important one. So it's called worry time. So usually when we talk about, or when we try and help kids with their worries and talk to them about things that are worrying them, we often do it in the moment, right? So we do it when the kids are actually upset and when they're maybe not thinking as clearly because they're so emotionally overwhelmed. And worry time is a way to really teach kids Let's see if that's, yeah, maybe something just was coming a little loose. Yeah, okay, it seems to be better. So I'll just go to the next slide. Thank you. So first, Josette and I are going to do, I'm going to come over here, and Josette and I are going to do a little role play of what happened with Henry when he was feeling, I'm going to try again. So when Henry's feeling anxious about going outside with his family, because he's so worried about the insects, how would his parents probably respond, right? When we're in the moment, we're going to show what happens in those moments when the kids are anxious and the parents are really trying their best to convince kids to do something that's making them anxious. So Josette is going to be Henry. And can our friends see us okay? Yeah, I think we're good, eh? Okay, so here's the back door, and we're about to go to eat outside. You've got your own. Perfect, okay. Okay, Henry, we're going to eat dinner outside tonight. I know you can do it, sweetie, and it's going to be so nice. It's a beautiful sunny evening, okay? So let's go.
No, I'm not going.
Yeah, I know you haven't been lately, but do you know what? There's not even that many bugs out tonight. It's kind of a cool evening, and I haven't seen any mosquitoes, so I think you're going to be just fine. So come with me.
No, I'm not going, Mom. I'm not going outside.
But you know what, Henry? We haven't eaten together as a family all week because you keep getting so upset about the bugs, and I know you can do it.
But there's a bunch of mosquitoes, and then there's the bees, and then there's a spider. I know there's a spider. There's a spider web.
And there's spiders outside. That's what's in the basement, and it's
How do
fine.
you know? You don't know that.
You're going to be okay. And do you know what? I haven't seen any bees. And the bees, if there are any, it's on the other side of the garden where the flowers are, not near the table.
You know what? My friend Jake today, he told me he got stung by a bee, and it hurts a lot, and then it becomes really big. I don't want to go, Mom. I'm not going.
So that's kind of, does that sort of sound familiar when kids are really anxious, right? So what am I doing as a parent? Thank you, Josette, by the way. So in the moment, I'm trying just to convince Henry, right? I'm trying to make it be okay, trying to reassure him. But it's really hard to convince him that everything is okay, because of course he's emotionally overwhelmed. Everything, all his anxiety is up. So of course when we're really emotionally overwhelmed, cognitively, things don't even work the same way. So it's not really the moment to try and convince him. So now we're going to talk about a different way of really helping kids with that. So worry time is a way of creating a specific amount of time every day where kids are actually encouraged to talk about their worries. So one thing that happens a lot in families is the worries start to spread into every part of family life when kids are really anxious. And that can also really negatively impact relationships because, of course, parents get worn down and get tired of hearing about it. So that's one aspect. But the most important part is that we actually want to teach kids how to contain their worries. So this is a really great skill for kids to learn, that they can actually delay thinking about and talking about worries, because the more we pay attention to things we're worried about, the worse we feel, right? There's actually a really good book that if anybody's looking for a good resource, this is a really wonderful book called What to Do When You Worry Too Much, A Kid's Guide to Overcoming Anxiety. It's a really nice one to read kind of chapter by chapter with your kids. I've got it in the resource list at the end of the slides. But you can see on the title, the cover of this book, that there's a tomato plant. And so the analogy they use in this book, which is a great one, is think about a tomato plant. The more you water it, the more sunlight you give it, the more the tomatoes eventually just keep coming and coming, and the tomato plant keeps growing. So similarly with our worries, if we nurture them by thinking about them and talking about them all the time, they actually get bigger. But by containing them, kids learn to distract themselves and move on to something else. And so that's what we're going to do with worry time. So the way it works is that you're providing a safe place for your child to talk about their worries. But it's time limited, and you're going to set aside a time every day when you do that. So what I often suggest to families is not doing it right before bed, because we actually want to leave time after you wrap up worry time. You want to leave time to help your child move on to thinking about something else. And usually the best way of doing that is for them to do an activity. So they can go play Lego, they can read a book, whatever it might be. So it's nice to do it a little earlier than just before bed, in my experience. And the idea is that during worry time, all they talk about is worries. And actually, if they start getting distracted and talking about other things, you want to bring them back and say, no, we're here to talk about your worries. And if they have to repeat the same worry a number of times, then get them to do that. You can wrap it up after 10 minutes. You don't have to do the full 15 minutes, but really make it about worries. Sometimes kids actually get bored of talking about their worries, and that's a good thing, because it's better to be bored than it is to be anxious, right? So, yes?
Is this something that you should be doing daily or once a week? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I recommend, yes, so the question is it something we should be doing daily, or is just a couple of times a week enough? So when families decide to do this, we always recommend do it every day for at least a week, right? And regularly, because it really does create that consistency, and it's hard on kids. So one of the things that's tricky about this is, say your worry time is after dinner every evening. So then if in the morning, as you're trying to get out the door, your child starts bringing up a worry, right? Something about the school day, maybe kids are bothering them, or maybe it's just the same worry that you've heard again and again, and you know you can't fix it in that moment anyways. The idea is that you want to say to them, remember, we're going to talk about that at worry time tonight. So it would be really hard if you only had it a couple of times a week, because that's too long for kids to wait. So what we're going for is we always want kids to feel safe and to feel they have a space to express their feelings. We really want to give that to kids. But we want it to be contained to a certain amount of time, because otherwise it's actually not helping them if they're talking about it all the time. It's actually making it worse. So yes, daily is good. Now, to be realistic, a night here or there does often get missed, but just trying to go for daily as much as possible. So what I recommend is pick a time of day that works for you and for your family, where you can do it consistently and try and make it part of the routine. So I was talking about this actually with a 9-year-old and her dad today when I was meeting with her, and they decided on after dinner, because they know if they don't do it right after dinner, the evening just gets away on them, right? Parents get busy with tidying up and kids get busy with other things, so that's kind of what works for them. Yeah. Yes.
Would you recommend both parents or just one, or?
Yeah, so the question is, do you recommend both parents do it or just one? So absolutely both parents is really nice, but no, just one parent is plenty as well. In my experience, it doesn't have to be both. And often realistically for a lot of families, either because it's a single parent family, it can only be one, or sometimes even for families, where there's multiple kids, something you really want to do is you want to keep other siblings away from interrupting. You really want to get rid of any interruptions. You want your child to feel like this is the time just for them, right? And that they are not going to get any distractions. So for example, both parent and child should put any screens away. Maybe you're just in the middle of cooking dinner, like you got to turn the stovetop off. You don't want to be distracted by that. I actually implemented this recently with one of the kids I was working with, and it actually worked quite well. That kids tend to love it because it's one-on-one time, right? And we know with the busyness of family life that sometimes you really want to make that time effort, and it takes a lot aside. So kids tend to really love this. They love having that one-on-one time with a parent. And so I had written down with the child the guidelines. No distractions. Mom or dad is paying complete attention to me. I'm not, playing with anything else. I'm only talking about my worries. And so when I had them back in and I was getting an update and I asked how it was going, the mom admitted that the daughter had gotten very annoyed at her because she was filing her nails as they were talking, and her daughter pointed to the guidelines we had made and she said, no distractions, put your nail file away. And I thought that was great because she was really advocating for herself. She was saying, no, this is my time, and this is all about me and my worries. So at the end of the 15 minutes, and you might want to put a timer on, then the key is to say to the child, okay, now, and you tell them in advance that this is how it's going to work. Now we're going to put the worries away, and we're going to move on to something else. And that can sometimes be hard for kids, or if worries come up later and you say, remember, worry time is done, and we can talk about that tomorrow at worry time. So it's teaching kids to contain it. Is there a question?
These are very specific scenarios. What happens if you have a child that can't explain why he's worrying?
That's a good question. So the question is, what if you have a child who can't verbalize or explain why they're worried? And that is a really good question. And there's a lot of reasons that might happen. Sometimes kids, like if there's developmental issues, right? Like they might struggle with expressing themselves verbally. And also sometimes kids just find it really hard to talk about their feelings. We're kind of, when you think about it, we're usually implementing this because you have a child who is very worried and expressing the worries, and so we're trying to contain it. But sometimes I do actually suggest it to families, even if the kids aren't constantly talking about their worries, just because it's such a great thing in terms of relationship building. It's really wonderful for parents and child to have that one-on-one time. So I guess that's where you can kind of get creative. So actually one thing I sometimes suggest is kids sometimes feel more comfortable to write down what's on their mind or what's worrying them. And if you have a child who's able to do that and willing to do that. So I've had kids, sometimes actually in my practice, I keep like little dollar store boxes and bags, and I give them to the child as a worry box. And they can write their worries down and then put the worry in the box. And then they can share it later with their parents. So that might be an idea, like if they're able to either, even like, you know, they can draw it out or write it out and then share it with parents that way later, that might help. Yeah, so it's good to be creative, and yeah, and that's their time with you, even if they're not kind of talking the whole time. Okay, I think there's another slide that talks a little bit more. And in your handout, which all of you hopefully picked up, if you didn't, there's 2 pages, kind of it's 3 total, back and front one and another. So the second page is guidelines for worry time. So you have that to take home with you. And so I have some of them here, like we said, we're setting aside about 15 minutes. The child can share any of their worries or fears, and parents just listen and support, no distractions. Oh, this is the other part I wanted to talk about. So it's really important to do a lot more listening than advice giving during this time, right? So what you really want to work on is using like active listening skills. If anybody came to the workshop last year, that's a lot of what we worked on, you know, with emotion coaching. So what I mean by active listening, well, I'm going to model some of it because Josette and I are going to do another little role play with Henry, but it's doing a lot of, so for example, if your child says, you know, I really hate what's happening at school because the kids are so noisy in class and I get so stressed out. So rather than saying, well, have you asked the teacher or have you asked to take a break and start giving advice, slow down, that's not what this time is about, right? So it's about saying, oh, so it's really noisy when you get in class and that really stresses you out. Showing your child you really hear what they're saying. This is what kids often really want, is they really want to feel heard and understood. So it's very powerful for them when they hear you say it back to them. So a lot of validating their feelings and using active listening is really, really important. And as we mentioned, when the time's up, then it's their job, and you can help them a little bit, but to engage in another activity that's going to make them feel better, that's going to distract them, so that they learn that I can contain my worrying. I can talk about it for 15 minutes, and then, you know, I can sort of close the lid on the box, you know, especially if you're actually using a box and getting them to write worries down, and I can move on and try and do something else. And that takes practice. It doesn't just happen just like that for kids, but they can learn to do it. Okay. So the benefits, as I mentioned, it's relationship building. It teaches the kids the skill of delaying, thinking about and talking about their worries, which actually in turn usually helps them to feel less anxious. Even just expressing your feelings reduces anxiety in itself. That can be really powerful. As we mentioned before, they might get bored of talking about their worries, and that is a very good thing if they start to find their worries boring. And once the worries decrease, so this is what often happens. After a couple of weeks, your child might suddenly say to you when you sit down to talk about your worries, I don't really have anything I'm worried about today. And so that's great. If that starts happening, then you can still get together and talk because it is so wonderful, and you don't want your kids to suddenly lose their special time with you just because they're doing better and less anxious. But you can rename it talk time, and then they can talk about things other than their worries. Talk about their day, just spend special time with you. So it's good to keep it going, but you can just rename it. And so definitely this happens, you know, sometimes then it just naturally the kids kind of, especially if we're using some of the other strategies that we talk about. So I think this is where Josette and I are going to do another little example. And this time we're going to look at Henry again. But it's going to be me sitting down with Henry to do some talk time rather than trying to solve the worrying in the moment. Or maybe we'll just stand, yeah. All right, okay, Henry, well, let's have our talk time, eh? We're all done dinner, we can, yeah, you ready? We can do our talk time?
Yeah, I guess we can do talk time right now.
Yeah. Hey, so tell me, any worries today? How are things going?
Well, you know, my teacher forced me to go outside to play, and I really didn't want to go outside to play because, you know, there's so many bugs out there.
Oh, I know, sometimes you don't like recess, eh?
No, I mean,
I'd
I'd love to stay in the library and just play board games.
You really love the library? What do you like about it?
It's so quiet.
There's no bugs in the library, that's so
And our
nice.
librarian is really nice and sweet. Yeah.
So you found it hard, you kind of didn't feel good about going out of recess, eh?
No, I didn't.
Did you end up going?
I did. But then it was like there was flies everywhere, and then it's like the bugs are coming
Lots
out
of
of the
flies.
sand.
Oh, there's bugs around the sand.
Yeah,
That was a bit scary for you?
it was. And then the big boys started to make fun of me.
Oh, what big boys?
The older boys, they were kind of like roaming around me and started throwing sand at me while I was playing in the sand.
Oh, so they were really
Yeah.
bothering you today?
They were.
I know they've been bugging you lately, eh? It's been hard to kind of manage recess.
Yeah, they're not super nice.
No, I
No.
know. That was hard, eh? Okay, thanks. So this is actually often what happens with kids that maybe have one particular word that they're focusing on a lot. So Henry, of course, is really worried about bugs. But again, you know, the worries often spread, and they might be around other things. So that would not be, you know, atypical that Henry would want to talk about his worries about insects and going out at recess. But then there's maybe other things that are bothering him, like kids are being mean to me, or, you know, my teacher was really upset today, or whatever it might be. And so you just talk about any of those things. And you really, so you might have noticed that I was just listening and showing Henry that I was interested, just validating his feelings, like, yeah, that is kind of hard, but trying really hard not to fix it, because as parents, we really like to fix problems for our kids, right? So it actually takes a concerted effort sometimes to hold back and not offer advice. But for kids that are anxious, they often get very annoyed by that, and it kind of makes sense because even us as adults, right, we get annoyed by that too, when you think about it. So for example, if any of you arrived home today and had had like a really, really bad day at work and said to your spouse, you know, oh, I had a brutal day, what would you rather your spouse say to you? Oh, that's so hard, sorry to hear that. Or, well, couldn't you just, like, I don't know, get up earlier and get your work done faster? Right? You don't really want advice in those moments. You want some validation. You want that person just to, you want to know that that person understands. So just try and kind of keep that in mind when you're having that time with your child. You're actually helping them more initially by just listening and validating their feelings. Okay. All right, so that was step 2. I'm just wondering about, do we want to do a quick break, or how are we doing? But I guess just keep going and leave time for questions, eh? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, if you need to get up or anything, feel free. We'll just keep going. Okay, so step 3 is using helpful thoughts. So remember the triangle that we had at the beginning? So we had our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. So the calm breathing kind of helps with everything. It helps with how we feel emotionally, it helps calm some of the physical sensations, and it's an action we can take. And we just worked on worry time, which is very, very helpful, again, for soothing kids. But working on the thoughts is really, really key for tackling anxiety, because our thoughts are very powerful. If you remember the example I gave around public speaking, for sure my thought patterns and my beliefs that I was terrible at it and that I really was going to feel terrible, that it was going to be an awful experience, really reinforced the avoidance, right? So we want to teach kids to be aware of their thoughts, to understand the difference between thoughts and feelings. That's actually not so easy for kids. They often need some kind of help and some practice to know that, for example, thinking, I can't do it, that's a thought, and maybe feeling nervous, that's the feeling, right? Like helping them understand the difference between feelings and emotions and thoughts. And so as we've talked about, there's a big connection between those 3 factors. So there's a lot of different ways of, I guess, thinking about thoughts. You know, we can talk about sort of negative versus positive, but I actually much prefer unhelpful versus helpful. And kids seem to really connect with this well. So unhelpful thoughts make us feel worried, fearful, scared, anxious, right? Helpful thoughts make us feel happy and calm. And one of the reasons I like the word helpful is that actually helpful thoughts are not always 100% positive. Sometimes it's more about thinking in a realistic, balanced way, and we're going to get more into that. Who was waking up a lot at night and who couldn't fall asleep without her parents actually being in bed with her, right? We talked about Jenny at the beginning. So if Jenny is really scared at nighttime and she can't fall asleep without her parents, what might be one of the thoughts that goes through her mind when she then wakes up in the middle of the night? So I just gave one example. A zombie is hiding in my closet and is going to get me, right? Little kids have a lot of different fears that bother them at night. So when she has that thought and she's convinced that a zombie is hiding in her closet, then how is she going to feel? Physically, her heart might start racing, right? She might feel really shaky. And obviously emotionally, she's scared, she's anxious. So then what's the behavior going to be? She's probably going to get up, run out of her room and go to her parents' room, right? To try and seek proximity to them. Okay. So let's think about how we can actually help Jenny start thinking differently. If we know that thoughts are really powerful, and that when she's thinking that there's a zombie in her closet, she's feeling really anxious and scared, how can we help Jenny to actually start thinking in a more realistic, balanced way? So the first thing is, it's very hard. Remember we talked about before how in the moment, like with Henry, in the moment for me to try and convince Henry to go outside when his anxiety was really up, he wasn't interested in any of my logic and reasoning, right? It's much easier to talk about the anxiety-provoking situations when the kids are not in the midst of it and when they're feeling calm. So the timing of when you decide to sit down and introduce to your child this concept of challenging their thoughts, definitely choose a moment where they're in a really good space, they're not feeling super anxious. So at a time that Jenny's calm, with support, we can really help exploring other brave ways to think about her safety if she does wake up at night. So with some support, you could probably help her to come up with some new helpful thoughts, such as, my house is safe, nobody can hurt me. Zombies are not real, they're just in the movies. My parents are close by and they won't let anything bad happen to me. I'm brave and I can stay here using my calm breathing. Right? So we're also bringing in another strategy. If you've already taught Jenny how to do the deep breathing, you could try and get her to do the deep breathing as part of when she's using her helpful thoughts. Okay. So you want to help your kids to practice using these thoughts to fight back against the worries, right? And I'm going to introduce, I think it's one of the upcoming slides, I'll talk about how you can help them ask some questions, some thought challengers. I'm going to get into that. But also modeling is really, really important. So us being able to use helpful thoughts has a really, really big influence on our kids. So, just like a random example, just think about the little day-to-day things about how our kids can even hear us sort of getting worried and being hard on ourselves. There's always opportunities to use some more sort of balanced, realistic thoughts. Right? So an example would be, say you're getting ready in the morning, you're having breakfast with your child, and you actually have a really busy day ahead of you, and you might even be feeling a little bit stressed. So that would be a great opportunity to say, wow, I have a really big day ahead of me. I've got some really big meetings, and it's going to be a really stressful day. But you know what? I know I can do it, right? So a helpful thought. I know I can do this, and if I focus and I work hard, right? I'm going to feel so much better at the end of the day when I've accomplished my day and I get to come home and see you again, right? Those are really helpful ways of thinking that actually can help us as adults also feel better when we're thinking that way. But it's so wonderful to model that for children. Okay. So I mentioned that there's thought challengers. So if you're sitting down with your child and really wanting to help them move away from a thought that's not helpful, it's good to teach them this skill of asking themselves some questions. So some examples would be, is that really true? Is there another braver way of thinking about this? Really talking a lot with kids about being brave and being courageous is really important when we're helping kids to try and overcome anxiety. Can I really expect myself to be perfect all the time? Because not in all situations, but in some situations, like with Leah, who's scared of doing the speech, you know, often there's a streak of perfectionism in anxious kids and they're worried about not doing well enough. So helping them to think about those things in a more balanced way and know, like, it's okay if I make mistakes. I don't have to be perfect all the time. That's a really helpful thought, right? Am I ignoring the positive, right? So helping them to think, are they just focusing on the negative and not thinking about the positive? So being able to kind of come up, and I have it again in the handout, there's actually, I've got sort of it outlined that there's a list of, so this one that says challenging thoughts. Oops. We've got our, testing, yeah, that's better. We've got our unhelpful thoughts, then our thought challengers, and then the helpful thoughts at the bottom. And so there's lots of examples for you to use there. But when kids practice this enough, they really start to catch on to it. One time I had a little boy I was working with that we were writing down thought challengers that he could ask himself when he was feeling anxious so he could try and come up with more helpful thoughts. And it was so cute because when he came in at the next appointment, he showed me that he had written them down on paper, folded them up and stuck them in his pocket. And when he was feeling nervous and anxious, he was pulling them out of his pocket and rereading them, you know, to prompt himself to think about them. And I thought that was amazing that, you know, he had thought of that strategy to sort of keep the thought challengers close at hand. So even writing things down can be great for kids. So in session, I do that all the time. We get out the markers and the paper. Kids like to make things really artistic. So getting them to write down some questions they could ask themselves, you know, to think more flexibly and think about things from some different angles. So I think we've got an example here that I'm going to show you. Oh, and so here's just some examples again of some helpful thoughts. So after you ask yourself those questions, then you change the thoughts that are making you anxious, the unhelpful ones, into helpful ones. So, you know, a number of examples. This is hard, but I can do it. I can try my best. It's okay to make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. This makes me feel worried, but I'm safe. Even though this is challenging, I can handle it. Right? So remember how I said before, it's not always about positive. Sometimes it's about realistic. So that would be an example, like getting kids to acknowledge, this is really challenging. This is hard for me. So if you have a child who's really, really anxious before they play sports, for example, which, you know, I definitely hear those examples of kids that get the upset stomach and get super anxious before their hockey game. So helping them to think those kind of helpful thoughts. You know, this is challenging to be performing and to be on the ice, but I can do it, right? Or I don't have to be the best player to be a really valuable part of the team. Just helping them to think about that in some really balanced ways. Is that making sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Okay? Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we're going to talk, this is the last step we're going to talk about. So this is about changing behaviors. So again, if you think about the triangle, we've worked on thoughts, we've worked on feelings, now we're thinking about behaviors. And you know what? You can talk with kids about their worries all the time. We could help them a lot with their thinking, but ultimately doing things differently is such a powerful way of kids actually managing their anxiety differently. So helping them to actually do the things that they're usually avoiding because they're anxious is really, really crucial for their anxiety coming down. It's like me with the public speaking, right? So the way that I actually started to get over my anxiety about public speaking was I ended up in a new position when I was at CHIO on the palliative care Rogers House team, and a big part of it was doing outreach to the community and talking about grief and bereavement. And so I really had to really step up. And luckily I had a friend who's also a therapist who gave me some really good advice and reminded me about strategies like using helpful thoughts and doing the deep breathing. And then, you know, I had a couple of occasions where I did it and it went really well and I got nice feedback from audience members and started shifting my thinking. But it was the actual doing, right? The getting up there, doing the talk while using my strategies and being able to look back and think, I did it and I survived. That was really what got me kind of over the worst part of it, right? So let's talk a bit about how we can help kids to change behaviors. So first of all, really working on fostering a culture of courage is super important. So you really want to be able to talk a lot about how even though things are hard, it's important often to do them, right? So we want to be really careful to make sure that kids understand that even if we're uncomfortable, even if sometimes we feel some distress, that doesn't mean that we should necessarily avoid that. Like there are certain things that are not fun to do, but it's really important that we do them, right? So we want to make sure that when kids do actually give themselves that push and do something that's difficult. So for example, for Henry, if I actually was able to get him out the door into the backyard and he was willing to sit down at dinner at the table on the patio, it's so important, first of all, that we reward and we praise for those accomplishments, right? And because for the doing and for being courageous. So saying, I'm so proud of you, you were so brave to come out here, even though I know that's really hard for you. I know you're feeling worried about the mosquitoes and the bees and even the spiders, apparently. But you still did it and you came outside, right? And so being able to talk a lot about courage is a really big key thing. And also us as adults modeling that. So being really careful to make sure that we're modeling, that we do things even sometimes when it's difficult or challenging and talk about that, right? And we want to be really careful about not reinforcing anxiety by allowing kids long-term to avoid things that make them anxious. So we have to be aware of crutches that sometimes actually reinforce anxiety. And this is a really tricky thing. It's not easy. But so for example, something that I'm hearing a lot about is how even the atmosphere in schools has really changed. I think teachers, and I know we have some teachers in the room, are facing huge challenges because there's more kids that are anxious, and parents also advocate very hard sometimes for their kids to not be in really uncomfortable situations. But for example, I taught at Carleton over the last 5 or 6 years to master's level students who sometimes had accommodations because of anxiety, that they couldn't be sort of called on out of the blue in class to be asked anything because of their anxiety. And it made me really uncomfortable as an instructor because I thought, how will the anxiety ever be reduced if you are never put in a situation where you challenge it? So I know a lot of times kids in schools, for example, don't have to do public speaking anymore if they have anxiety issues. And it's so important that we work on supporting kids and giving them coping strategies, but ultimately giving them the stepping stones to achieve those goals. Because when I look at my adult students at Carleton that weren't able, to do those things because of anxiety, it was really heartbreaking to see them held back in that way. And so when we have young kids that are struggling with trying to get out of things that make them feel really scared and nervous, we have to find that balance of supporting, but also giving them those supportive pushes and encouragement to do it. So another big trend that we're seeing that I think is connected is school refusal. So that was something that was almost unheard of, 20, 30 years ago, but now there's actually a term for it. And for all of us that work in mental health, it's something we're seeing all the time, right? Is kids that are really anxious and school makes them anxious, or there's something else that's making them anxious and stay home, and we have 12-year-olds that are missing a whole year of school. And then it's really hard to get them back in. And so we want to really be careful about fostering this culture of courage and knowing that we have to do things even though they're difficult, so that they can then feel the sense of accomplishment. It's been really rewarding for me having kids come into my practice who aren't in school and seeing them get back and just how their anxiety just keeps going down once they're doing the same routine as all their peer group, right? They feel so much better about themselves. It's so hard on them to be out of those routines. So anyways, that's a tricky thing, but I'm going to give you some strategies that we can start kind of thinking about for working on changing behaviors. So gradual exposure is really important. So obviously, if we have a child, for example, like if we think of Henry, right, who's just terrified of bugs, we're not going to all of a sudden, take him to a garden that has the flowers that attract bees and have him surrounded by bumblebees. That would just not be successful in terms of helping Henry to overcome his fear of bugs, right? So we want to think about building it up gradually, right? So you actually want to be able to sit down with your kids, talk about how important it is to do things even though it's scary and hard, and how you're going to be so proud of them for being brave, and give give them other strategies like working on thinking the helpful thoughts, working on the calm breathing. All those things are going to make it a little more doable. And then you want to come up with gradual steps. So there's actually really good handouts that I use with kids. So for example, in the Friends for Life program, if anyone's interested, I can show you after. It's actually a picture of a staircase. And we write down on each stair what the next goal is going to be. So it gives kids a really good visual of kind of climbing that staircase, right? Because if you want to get to the top of the stairs, we don't jump up to the top step. We walk up each step one by one. And that's how we get to our ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal for Henry is maybe to just be outside with his friends and play, or go to a soccer game, even if there might be some bugs out that night, right? So how do we get to that goal? We want to break it down into little baby steps, right? So, for example, I ran a group for kids who have a tendency towards anxiety, this Friends for Life program, which I mentioned in the spring. And Henry is actually based on one of the kids that was in my group he was Henry. Like, he was really not going outside, and his parents were very worried about how he wasn't having any fun because of his fear of bugs. And there's a few other kids in the group of 6 that also had that fear. And so we worked on this gradual exposure, and the kids actually helped on a big piece of paper that we had up on the wall. We brainstormed all ideas, and then we drew the staircase, and we came up with one step at a time. And so we started out with very small steps. So for example, we watched a video that had a bumblebee in it. And of course, kids do love videos, so that's a good way, a nice kind of first step. But for a kid who's really scared of bugs, that does bring up some anxiety, so that's good exposure. So it was actually, I just happened to randomly come across this video about a woman in England who kept a bee as a pet. It was a bee she found in her garden that had no wings. So she'd walk around the house with this bee sitting on her nose. It was actually really cute. So I showed this video to the kids, and of course they loved it. They thought it was funny. And they're in a group, so the ones that are anxious about bugs kind of push themselves to watch this, and that's exposure. Just having a whole conversation where a kid like Henry has to talk about maybe going to a soccer game and he's going to feel anxious, that's also the start of exposure. So I'll give you another example of how we can do exposure with one of the case examples. So let's think about Leah, who was really scared and ready to skip school on the day of her speech. So if her parents were able to sit down and really help her with coming up with some steps, what are some smaller, easier steps that Leah could take? So, for example, she could practice her speech all by herself, using her calm breathing before she starts, and doing some coaching. Parents could do some coaching about how important it is to speak slowly so she doesn't get out of breath. And then she could just be left to practice on her own. Then she gets a reward. It's so important, and this is actually teaching kids early on about self-care. As adults, we don't do enough of rewarding ourselves for all our hard work. We really should do a lot more of it, right? And so it's actually great to teach kids, just for resilience and mental health, that when you work hard, give yourself a reward. But there's a term in the Friends for Life program that always has stuck with me, a reward that money can't buy. Don't be going out to Toys R Us and buying them the big new toy. It doesn't have to be like that, and in fact, it shouldn't be like that. So often for kids, the best rewards are one-on-one time with you. So maybe they get to, bake some cookies with you after dinner and get that time, or play a card game, or maybe there's something else they want to do, right? Help them think of ideas. But something like that. So you can plan it out in advance. Like, Leah, when you get that done and you practice your speech, then we're going to do this and celebrate. Because I know this is hard for you, but I know you can do it. Once she's done that, then another day, she could come up with a second step, which is to do her speech just for her family at home. So she's still in the comfort of home, not in the anxiety-provoking situation of school, and she practices her speech. And again, we do lots of reward and praise for her being so courageous. Then maybe she could invite a few friends over as step 3 and practice it at home, but with some friends there from school. That would definitely be a step up for most kids, right? That would bring up her anxiety, but at least she's still at home, so it's a little more doable, and she could do it. Step 4, she could present the speech to her teacher and maybe a friend for support during recess. Most teachers are really, open to helping kids with those. They want to see kids be able to help overcome those kinds of anxiety issues. And so, a lot of teachers actually already, often that's worked into sort of accommodations for kids I've worked with, that instead of doing presentations in class, they can do it just to the teacher. And so what I would say is, don't let that be the ultimate goal. Let that be a stepping stone towards the ultimate goal of her being up in front of the class, right? And so then the final step is she presents her speech in front of her class and hopefully rewards herself with something really fun, right? Because that's a big thing for her to do. So that's what we mean by gradual exposure. It's kind of breaking it down into steps that are a little more reasonable and attainable. And that's how we get to the ultimate goal. Okay, perfect. So definitely important to involve kids in the planning of this. We want to take a collaborative approach, get the kids, to give you their ideas, keep telling them how proud you are of them. Explore any unhelpful thoughts that might be getting in the way. So this is a great opportunity to really brainstorm with your kids. Like, what are you most worried about? What's the worst thing that could happen? Let them get all that out. Even write down all their thoughts that are most connected to their fears and worries, and then help them work on replacing them with more helpful ways of thinking, right? And actually, I want to give an example of that came up with my own daughter recently, because I think it might be helpful. So as I mentioned, my daughter is very anxious, and she has a pretty significant issue with stuttering. So she's been in speech therapy for a few years. But for anybody who's known someone who stutters, it's not easy, and it definitely can make her stand out with her peers. So she's in grade 6 this year. So you know how when they're in grade 6, they're at the top of the school, or at her school anyways, they're the oldest. So there's all sorts of jobs that are available to them. And so her school decided to try something new this year, where instead of the vice principal and principal doing the morning announcements, they're letting the older kids do the morning announcements. And she really likes to help out and be involved. So she came home and she said to me, I'd really like to try out an audition to do the morning announcements. So I said, well, good for you, go for it. That would be so much fun. And as it turned out, they weren't just doing it over the intercom, they were actually videotaping them, and they have the smart screens or whatever in all the classrooms. So then they're emailing it to the teachers, and it's like broadcast for all the classes. So they're also on camera, which is a bit intimidating for the kids. So she was thinking about it over the course of a week or two. She knew it was coming up, that they were going to ask who wanted to do it. And then one day she said, I don't know if I should do it, because what if kids make fun of me? So this is a very common fear for a lot of kids, right? So probably for Leah, getting up in front of and doing a speech, right? There's always that worry about what if we don't look smart enough? What if we don't do well enough, right? And there was this part of me, and maybe some of you can relate to this if you have anxious kids, that thought, oh, don't do it. Because what if kids do make fun of you? It's happened before, and it's heartbreaking as a parent when your kid comes home and tells you that someone, imitated their stutter. It's so hard. And there was this part of me that thought, almost guaranteed, if she stutters, some kid, there's going to be, 300 kids in the school listening to this, someone probably will say something and it could get back to her. So luckily, because of the work I do, I was able to kind of catch myself, and I thought, that's not really helpful in the long term, right, if I encourage her to not do this. And so I remembered about the unhelpful thoughts and helpful thoughts. So I have a lot of really bad moments as a parent, but this was a better one. And so I said, well, what's the thing that's the most scary for you, Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? So she said, well, if I have trouble with my speech, and then kids start making fun of me. So I was like, okay. So I was trying to think, okay, well, what's a more flexible way of thinking? Because that could happen, realistically. And so I said, well, but I'm kind of wondering, even if someone who doesn't stutter, who does the announcements, they might get made fun of too. There's usually always a few class clowns that are going to find something to poke fun at. And then she paused and she said, that's true, because the principal's be doing the announcements, and there's always kids making fun of her. Which was really, I thought, yeah, and she speaks just perfectly. She doesn't have any speech issues. And so it was, and it seemed to just help her kind of think differently. And I said, so there's always going to be someone, if you kind of put yourself up there and you get up on a stage to perform. So whether it's your kid getting up and performing in the school play, or trying out for the competitive soccer team, there's always that risk, right, of getting hurt or getting disappointed. So in that moment, do we try and protect them from all hurt, or do we try and help them to be really brave and know that they can handle it, right? Anyways, so I was really proud of her because she did go on, and you know what? She was the only grade 6 student that volunteered to do it. She's the only kid with a stutter, and she was the only kid that actually, because a lot of the kids were quite anxious about being on screen. A whole bunch of grade 5s wanted to do it though, so that was good. So anyways, just a little example of how we can try and really use getting kids to think about things from different angles, just whatever you can do to help ask them questions and get them to think about things from other perspectives. So I wanted just to kind of talk a little bit about, when do you know that you can just do all of this at home on your own, and when do you get someone to guide you and help you? And I don't know that there's any particular right or wrong, but what I would say is, for kids that are really struggling, so for example, for kids that are not attending school because they're so overcome by their anxiety, that's a good example of where it's really important to get some other people on your side as a parent. It's a lot to deal with that level of anxiety all by yourself. You deserve to have support as a family. You shouldn't have to do it all alone, and your child deserves that support. Kids will often be more open to challenging themselves and being uncomfortable, which overcoming anxiety entails, when someone who is not their parent is giving them suggestions. I think that's pretty normal for a lot of kids, that they're often and parents will sometimes say that to me, I suggest something and the kids try it out and the parent says, and I must have said that about 20 times, right? But that's the nature of how some kids are more like that than others. So it can be a really big support to have someone who's just outside the family and who's more neutral emotionally, kind of suggesting these things to the kids, coming up with the plan with them. And then, the way it works for a lot of us child therapists is then we bring the parent in for the latter part of the session, and we all talk about the plan together, and then it's super clear, right? So that can be really helpful. So I would say, if it's causing a lot of stress in your relationship with your child, and you're feeling really tense, and it's really hard to even talk about the anxiety, then it can be really helpful to get someone involved who's going to kind of lessen some of that tension and provide support. If you want your child to have someone other than you to talk to about it, again, it's going to be sort of a more neutral person. And the other thing is you can try all these strategies at home, and if you're just finding that your child is still really stuck and you're not getting anywhere, then definitely reaching out for help. So in terms of resources, actually, Josette might be able to help me a little bit more because she's more familiar with all the resources on the Quebec side. But if you do, so for example, where I work at CAFCO, and there's a lot of private practices, most people use their benefits through their work plan to pay for it. So for example, if you work for the federal government, you have a benefits plan that includes $2,000 a year for psychology services. And so that's enough to get, a number of sessions for your child and get them some support. So there's that as one option, right, to go private if you happen to have a benefits plan that will help you pay for it. If you're looking for more publicly funded resources, it's the SALS.
Yeah.
So in Quebec now, the main access point for any type of social services is 811. So you call and you can self-refer. And you give information about your child, your family, what you're going through, and then they triage through that. In our high schools, we're lucky that we have guidance counselors too, who sometimes support students who are going through significant anxiety. We have some CLSC social workers within our high schools that guidance can refer to as well.
And that can be a great option for kids to actually get the services. And that can be a great option for kids to get the services at school, right? It's nice for families and for the kids themselves not being pulled out of school and taken somewhere else. So that's always a good option to look into for sure. So there's kind of all those options available. Right? So, and Connexions Resource Centre, that's also an option.
People can call us too if they want guidance to using the public system or referrals to. There aren't a lot of community organizations or other institutions that offer services in English here for this kind of thing, but we do have some things to suggest, so feel free.
Did everybody hear that? Just that you can call Connexions even if it's for some guidance about where to go and what might be most helpful for you. And for sure, I think what parents are all facing is that there can be wait lists and there's maybe not enough resources always to go around, but there is support out there. So definitely ask questions and seek that if that's something that you feel your child needs. I also just wanted to mention books because actually there's so many amazing resources that are available that you can use. So I had mentioned this being a really good book, and I really would, for any of you who have school-age kids, like anywhere from kind of 6 up to 12 years old that are dealing with anxiety, this is probably one of my favorite. You use this one too, Josette. It's really wonderful. It's nice because it's actually got activities that your child draws and writes down things as you go along. And what I really like about resources like this is actually when you read it as a parent, it helps you to understand anxiety and how it's working that much more. So you have a better understanding, and it gives you a common language to use with your kids. So they do things in this book that I didn't have time to cover tonight. Like, for example, playful, there's so many wonderful ideas. And when kids read that with you, and you kind of work on it step by step, it can be very helpful. Yeah, so those are just some ideas. Any questions? Yeah. Oh, you're going to show the book. Great idea. Yeah, and so the book, it's in the reference section at the end of my slides, which everybody can access, as was mentioned earlier, but it's called What to Do When You Worry Too Much, A Kid's Guide to Overcoming Anxiety by Dawn Huber. You can order it on Amazon, Chapters, those places all carry it. Any questions from the audience? Or from our parents that are at St. Michael's? Any questions at St. Michael's? No? Okay, good. Okay. Any questions here?
Yes.
Your worry time is very separate because it's your active listening, and then you're looking also for solutions so to change the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So when do you suggest those different conversations happen?
Yeah.
To maximize.
Good question. So the question is, so worry time, we're not giving advice. So then, but then we know that when it comes to thinking helpful thoughts or to changing behaviors, you are guiding and making suggestions to help your child along. So how do you kind of strategize? So that's a really good question. And although we presented things tonight in a certain order, it doesn't always have to be in that exact order, actually. So you're right that you want to keep worry time separate. You want that to be something that you do just for that 15 minutes a day. And you don't want to get in. You can, if your child asks for advice during that time, for sure you can give them some like reassurance and a little bit of guidance. But you just want to be careful to not start doing that too quickly. And so definitely looking for a different time, right? To just not blending them too much, that when you're then working on the helpful thoughts, the unhelpful thoughts. But for example, you know how we said that kids sometimes then get to a point where they say, you know, I'm not really worried anymore. But they might still have worries, but they're just sort of, they're all under control. And then you change over to talk time, right? You rename it as talk time. So, you know, that can definitely then become a time for talking about various different problems and giving them some reassurance or ideas during that time too. It's just at the beginning when they're first really overwhelmed and worried, like very highly anxious, you just want to be careful to do lots of the active listening and not get into advice giving. But later on, I think you can start blending them a little bit more. Yeah. And actually, if you're kind of feeling, because it is a bit overwhelming knowing where to start, again, like a resource I think would be great is to, for example, get one of these guides, like the one I mentioned. If you look online, you know, there's other very similar books. Because sometimes having the structure of a guide like that, just to give you kind of step-by-step what to tackle first, can be really helpful. Because I know it is quite a lot. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
For split parents, is there like a reference for how to deal with when things might be different at the other time?
That's a great question. So if you have family where parents are separated, how do you sort of, what would be some ideas about how to kind of deal with getting both homes on board? Yeah, that can definitely, even in intact families, it can be hard to get both parents sort of thinking about it the same way and feeling the same way. So that's a really good question. And when it comes to co-parenting, I mean, maybe one idea again with like having a common language can be really helpful. So for sure, I've seen parents, you know, that are separated, like in the better situations where if they're bringing the child in for counseling, they're doing it together, so they're getting that support as well. Therapists are always really happy if both parents want to come in for the sessions and do the work together, if that's possible. Or if you in your home start implementing worry time, and maybe you're using a resource like my handout to guide you, or the book Overcoming Worries, like sharing it with the other parents so they have the same language. And that definitely can help the kids if all the adults are kind of using similar terms and similar ideas. But you know what, it's amazing how kids, so for example, in my Friends for Life group, we definitely were giving homework for parents to do at home, but it really varied how much the kids were practicing the skills at home. Every kid was a bit different, because we would check with them, and their parents weren't in the room, and these kids were very honest. They're like, no, didn't touch the homework, didn't practice those skills. But they all still really benefited, because when we looked at the end, and when I had to sort of follow up with the parents, you know, a lot of the kids, so for example, Henry, not his real name, who had such a fear of bugs, when I talked to his parents 2 months later to do a follow-up, I found out he had totally overcome his fear of bugs, right? And so the kids really benefited, but I know actually several of them were in homes where their parents were separated. So I know there wasn't 100% consistency in all environments, but you know, kids will absorb it in one environment and hopefully can carry over too, yeah. Even we know, so for example, the Friends for Life program is used in all the schools in British Columbia. And again, it's the teachers that are actually given the training and that are implementing it within the school. So I'm guessing that it's probably not easy for everything to get passed along to the parents. There might be some communication. But again, when they've done research, they've seen really positive outcomes. You know, even though it's just in the school environment that the kids are learning the skills, I guess they're able to then transfer it over out into the community and at home. Yeah. Yes.
When you discuss about the strategy, you talk about kids, but this also can be used with teenagers or
Absolutely,
adults. Like,
yeah.
for example, my son's autistic, he's 16 years old, but his intellectual level is probably more like if he's 10 or 12. Or
That's right, so it would work very well, for sure. Yeah, and actually, you know, a lot of the strategies, for sure, I mean, the helpful thoughts, unhelpful thoughts, I do that with my adult clients all the time. We do what's called thought records, and we identify the thoughts that are making us either anxious or depressed, and we work on challenging them and changing them. These are all strategies that can be used with all age groups. You maybe just adapt it slightly to make it a little more mature for the teenagers. But you know, for example, the handout I gave today with challenging thoughts, where you know we sort of list the unhelpful thoughts, we come up with thought challengers. I do that with teenagers all the time. Yeah, we make a little chart, you know, and we kind of list the unhelpful thoughts and helpful thoughts. So yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah. Yes.
Or just to, I guess, just rephrase that. It's not to give advice, but it's more to guide, so that you can have your children work through the problems on their own.
With the worry time?
Well, I guess going towards more of the advice to parents when we're talking with our kids about their issues. It's not giving them advice to fix, but it's having them.
Yeah, so that's a good question, you know, like are we giving the kids advice? How are we helping them to solve things? So I guess one way to think about it is, if we can get kids to be really part of coming up with the ideas, that's always the best. You know, when an idea comes from ourselves, we're always a little more motivated to use it. Sorry, there we go. So definitely taking a collaborative approach, but absolutely give suggestions. Like when I mentioned about in the worry time, not giving too much advice, that's kind of specific to that worry time. But no, I mean, parents play a very active role often in helping kids to think in a different way, to challenge and to do things that are really hard. So you can definitely, I think taking an approach where you ask kids for their ideas and you show respect for what they can come up with too, and you kind of take a teamwork approach is the ideal, right? So I guess it's taking that, encouraging them to be brave, using that kind of language, yeah.
Just to think about if this is younger kids, it's like they cannot talking, they cannot writing, they cannot drawing anything. How we deal with that?
So the question is, what about with really young kids who aren't talking yet? So I mean, for sure, you know, if we're talking about preschoolers, you know, you're not going to be able to really work on changing unhelpful thoughts to helpful thoughts. And so I think when it comes to really little kids, where we're maybe seeing anxiety through behavior, you know, like crying at drop-off in the morning, for example, but, you know, that it goes on, or whatever it might be, or, you know, the separation anxiety. First of all, looking at what's developmentally appropriate, because sometimes what's not appropriate at age 8 is really within the norm at age 3, right? So like keeping all that in mind. But if it's for sure become like a real issue, I mean, I would go back to those basics that we talked about at the beginning, when you think about what really fosters resiliency, right? When we're looking at really young kids. So thinking about lots of free play, use of creativity, working on the relationship. You know, I think with really young kids, like last year when we did the emotion coaching, that's really important, like doing lots of soothing them by validating their feelings. Even if they can't voice their feelings, sometimes we can figure out what's going on, like what is scaring them or worrying them, and we can voice it for them, and that can be really validating for kids. Like, well, you seem really upset, or you're scared to go to bed without mommy lying down with you, you know, something like that. So putting it into words for them where we can. But I would say with the really little kids, like we really want to go back to that, those building blocks that we talked about at the beginning, of all the things we know that really foster emotional resilience. Yeah. Yes?
My daughter was worried there. I was anxious.
Oh.
I'm a grandma.
Okay.
You know, because usually kids are very shy to talk, but like my grandson, like every time we go to the park, is there something like it's important to do something that they like, and we go to the park and then he talks to me.
Right, so with the really little kids, that when you're like connected with them, I totally agree. So often they will open up and share their feelings more when they feel that connection, right? And that goes back to like those early slides where we talked about that face-to-face time, being outside, being in nature, being engaged in play. We can sometimes get more from kids, for sure.
And the house is more reserved, it's more reserved.
Yeah. He's more reserved inside, and you see him. Yeah, that's so typical for kids, right? So yeah, it's so important to remember those things. Thank you. I know probably a lot of people have to leave because I know our time is up. If you do, I can stick around for a bit, so if you have any other questions, feel free to approach me. I'll hang out up here for a little while.
Yeah, and I just wanted to let you know that we'll do a summary of tonight and have Joanne's resources on there, and we also have lots of resources on our site from her last presentation, and we've been working, so we have a list of books that some of you may have gotten on big emotions from last year's presentation, but they're Thank you. So I was just saying that there are lots of resources on the Connexions website, and one of them is we've done these mental health kits, and there are templates on the website, and they're for kids to put together, and they can color, and you can talk to them while you talk about what they can do to reduce stress and anxiety, and what they can do to make themselves feel better when they're feeling low or anxious. And there's some for adults too, because we all need pampering as well. And this is another book that Natalie, who does our support group for parents with special needs, has used with the parents, and so it's just another resource that could be interesting if you want to work on the breathing. So, and again, she's got resources like the fidget spinners and that sort of thing on there. So I would encourage you to go to the website to find out more, and I would like to say a big thank you to Joanne, and it's been great again. And I would encourage you to also fill out, we've got an evaluation form that's going around or is on the table back there. We really appreciate your feedback and to learn what else you'd like to hear about. So please take the time to fill it out. Oh, thank you, St. Mike's, for joining us. Bye.